Now, after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, some businesses in the U.S. West became more receptive to Asian women immigration. For example, during the late 1800s, actually in Hawaii, plantation managers actually requested a small number of women because they thought that the presence of women would have a beneficial effect on the men there, and therefore, helping towards a more stable labor force in the Hawaii plantation. So here's it is important because this marks the transition from the Asian migrant as being sojourners to that of being settlers. Okay, this is an important transition, and it's definitely more pronounced with the Japanese compared with the earlier Chinese. So obviously, women here, they're an important dimension this to this transition from a sojourner, that's to say, someone who comes here temporarily and works and then returns to their home country, to that of permanent settlement in the U.S. Yet still, similarly to Chinese women, the initial migration of Japanese women arriving to the American West was scarce in numbers. According to the U.S. immigration statistics, only 1,195 Japanese women arrived to the U.S. between the 1860s and 1900. Also, similar to Chinese women, many of these women were prostitutes, also brought to the States by slave traffic. Many of such women were abducted or they were deceived or lured into coming to America. They were fed stories of riches in America that could be earned here. And then once they were abducted, they were sold to a trafficker. And then many of them had to be smuggled into the U.S. They were referred to by both Japanese immigrants in America and actually officially by the Japanese government as senpu, as noted in the slide there, senpu, which translates roughly to, quote, base women. And these women, similar to the Chinese prostitutes, also lived this tragic slave like existence once they were forced into prostitution across the Pacific. Now, compared to China at the time, Japan was a rising empire, becoming in close league with some of the European empires at that time. And therefore, Japan was very concerned about its national reputation, their stature, their image before the rest of the world. And because of this, Japanese government officials were very concerned. In fact, they were appalled, really, at the arrival and the presence of prostitutes in America. And indeed, they feared that the presence of such women would cause anti Japanese sentiment similar to that displayed towards the Chinese earlier. Like, let's remember the Page Act, and the reason was supposedly for moral reasons, right? The immoral influence of Chinese women. Now, here's a quote from a Japanese consulate in his worries over prostitution. Quote, if matters are left as they are today, illicit Japanese houses inevitably will be established soon all over the U.S. At present, the Japanese are prone to incur the enmity, that means the hatred, enmity of Americans like the Chinese. If we allow the prostitutes to carry on unhindered, what will be unavoidable is that prostitution will become a basic pretext in the hands of Japanese exclusionists, unquote. So again, this reflects not just the stain on Japan's national honor, but that the concern here was it would also trigger exclusion of the Japanese from the United States. Now, regarding wives here, so we're looking at the different types of women coming over in the earlier times. There's senpu, but then there's also wives. And as previously mentioned, the Japanese government uh, eventually permitted the migration of Japanese wives to the US. So, with the early decades of the 20th century, many Japanese men summoned their wives, if they had wives in Japan. In 1900, there were only 410 married women in Japanese immigrant society in the United States. By 1920, just 10 years later, this number leaped to 22,193. So that's an exponential leap here. And by the way, if you're familiar with the Alien Land Acts, right, that passed in this period, well, this is oppression that's wielded upon the Japanese in the West. So, despite this oppressive legislation wielded towards Japanese, the fact that they still summoned their wives and became married reflects the Japanese spirit of resistance, really, in face of these measures to prevent their settlement. Right. Okay, so some of the women coming were wives left behind. Others were women who married single men in the United States. What they did is they returned to Japan to seek wives, and then they accompanied them back. But many were picture brides, where the man was not present in Japan. And here's a practice whereby immigrant men selected brides through an intermediary, a matchmaker, really. And this was done through the use of photographs and even family recommendations. Okay, obviously, the long distance, geographical distance between them meant that they didn't know anything about each other before marriage. But when you really compare it to tradition in Japan, actually the picture bride system didn't depart too sharply from traditional Japanese marriage custom. In tradition, um, marriage was always a family matter. It's not like, let's say, in the modern US, like today, where it's more of an individual matter, right? Um, in Japan, it's a family matter. You have the heads of families, usually the father, right, selecting marriage partners through intermediaries. So even then, intermediaries are involved. And sometimes it involved an exchange of photographs, along with other criteria such as, what's the wealth of the this potential bride, what is the family, genealogy, education, all these other criteria. And yeah, they actually got to meet each other before marriage in Japan, but they really didn't get to become truly acquainted with each other. Okay, after all these meetings, it's for the benefit of the family, not designed for future couples to really become acquainted with each other before marriage, as it is in the West, in the U.S. That is. So, in many ways, the picture bride practice really conformed to this custom. That is, single immigrant men had their families pick a bride for them, and along with the photographs of themselves, the men had to forward information about their lives in America. So the only way it really departed or deviated from traditional custom in Japan was that bridegrooms were physically absent at the wedding ceremony. Otherwise, it's very similar to arranged marriages in Japan. But legally, these marriages were considered, well, they're legal, they're legitimate, with one bureaucratic conditions. They had to enter the names of their wives into their own family registries. And this way, men became legally responsible, not only legally wed, but responsible for the women in America. And indeed, the Japanese consulates in the United States set rigid standards that had to be met. Japanese migrant laborers were actually ineligible to partake in this practice if you were a common laborer at first. It wasn't until 1940 15 that they were allowed to partake in this, uh, as opposed to businessmen and the more richer farmers who participated. Why were laborers not allowed? Because they sometimes didn't have proof that they could support the women, right? You had to make a certain amount of money in order to actually allow to partake in the pitcher bride system. Okay, and similarly, women had to satisfy specific government regulations too. As I said earlier, their names had to be officially entered into the groom's family registries. There was an age regulation of 13 years old, which is, in our mind, in the West, right, very young, but allowable in their tradition. They had to pass a health exam, make sure they're not afflicted with, diseases, contagious disease. Most of these women had no say. They're simply obeying their parents. And, to refuse your parents was an act of filial disobedience, and that's considered a grave offense in their custom. And, there are interesting oral testimonies of pitcher brides. Some, or actually many, were genuinely shocked to see their new husbands. Often husbands used earlier photos of them, right, when they were younger. And some pitcher brides just bemoaned the fact that they were marrying a, quote, old man, right? And also, once they entered the States, they had to discard their traditional Japanese clothing, like kimonos and that Japanese sandals, as part of their entry and initiation into American society. It was common for the men to take their wives to the Western clothing store to outfit them with Western clothes, right? And in these oral testimonies, these women describe barely able to deal with the women's clothes because it constricted. They had trouble breathing and they had trouble walking in the shoes and everything. Okay, so in accordance with this practice, the majority of wives who entered immigrant society between 1910 and 1920 were indeed pitcher brides. And again, this allowed the family formation of Japanese Americans to begin apace. Yet at the same time, it also engendered protests from anti-Japanese nativist groups. And here we have to remind ourselves the link between gender and family and permanent settlement. It's obvious by now how women are centrally involved in the nativist fears of permanent settlement, since their presence, women that is, enables Japanese families on U.S. soil. And indeed, the nativists claim that the pitcher bride system was a violation of the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. That was their claim. So, actually, what happened as a result of Japanese council by 1919, because of the nativist agitation, well, they were forced to recommend to Tokyo that it suspend the issuance of pitcher bride passports. So, by 1920, there were no more passports issued to pitcher brides. Now, compared to the Chinese merchant wives that I discussed earlier, where they lived a life of leisure, many of these women, um, they were with well-off Japanese farmers. Okay, they weren't exactly poor. They lived in the more rural areas rather than, let's say, a Chinatown, right, ethnic enclave, where they labored quite intensively alongside their husbands on the farm. And even those in the urban areas, if they lived there, they labored intensively in the family small business, like, restaurants, laundries, or they worked as domestic servants. So they endured a life of unending labor compared to the wives of Chinese merchants, right, who lived a life of leisure. Okay, so again, we have to remember Asian women are a crucial factor in family formation, and therefore the possibility of permanent Asian